This video is brought to you by PPLIR Europe, a not-for-profit community of European general aviation pilots dedicated to helping ourselves and others to use our licenses to the full. We share our passion for flying through mutual exchange of expertise, experience, information, inspiration, and education. We also assist regulators in framing legislation that affects all GA pilots. We're almost all volunteers and do it because we love it, though we do also need to raise a little money, mainly to fund our representation and lobby activities. Please join us, improve and broaden your own flying, enjoy belonging to a community of like-minded pilots, and help us represent you.
Hi, there's been a lot of discussion and many questions on the PPLIR forum about the transition from ground into the airways and back again, with airfields connected to the controlled airway system and otherwise, and how it varies across different countries in Europe. This is a short, simple video giving straightforward answers to these questions for the less experienced. There are just too many different cases for me to be able to cover every eventuality, but if you use your instincts and common sense overlaid on the basics I lay out here, you should be able to cope with most scenarios. Remember, if in doubt, ask. Think of controllers as waiters, not police officers. So let's start with the sequence if you're starting at what I would call a connected airfield. By that I mean somewhere with a SID or departure. The difference between a SID and a departure is that a SID is in controlled airspace and must be followed, whereas a departure goes outside controlled airspace and, for the portion outside controlled airspace, can only be considered a strong recommendation. Having said that, you treat them just the same, except that you have more responsibility for traffic and terrain while outside controlled airspace. There are a few countries, notably Germany and Switzerland, where there's no possibility of IFR outside controlled airspace, so there are no departures. At such connected airfields, which are mostly international airports, there may well be a published procedure for who to talk to and when before departure. There's no alternative but to read these procedures, which sometimes cover several pages in JEP or the AIP. It's impossible to generalize completely, but the sequence will normally be to listen to the ATIS and then to call for start on a delivery, clearance, or ground frequency. At some airports, that has to be done at a certain time, typically 10 minutes before you wish to taxi, or if you have a slot, before your calculated takeoff time. Different airports have different standards for how long to allow between taxi and takeoff. At other airports, it's more at your discretion when to make the call. As it does happen from time to time, you're told to listen on the frequency for engine start. It's a very good idea to use a handheld rather than the aircraft battery. It could be 20 minutes or half an hour, and having the electrics and avionics on that long can compromise your ability to start, both on piston and turbine aircraft. Be ready with pen and paper or electronic scratch pad, as they're very likely to come straight back with your full clearance without asking whether you're ready. Also, before you call, have a look at all the SIDs and departures available in the general direction you're going, such that you recognize, despite their accent, what you're being given. Just occasionally, you'll be given a different letter to that in Jeppesen. For example, a Javri 1 Juliet when you expected a Javriette 1 Kilo. If that happens, you must query it, and if their revision level is different to yours, establish which is correct. If you cannot resolve the discrepancy, ask for a different departure on which you can agree. Usually, the clearance includes an altitude or flight level, and if it does, that supersedes anything written on the SID plate. Again, procedures vary, but most clearance delivery frequencies will end by telling you to call when ready for taxi on ground. Listen, because at large airports, there may be more than one ground frequency. Occasionally, at the largest airports, you'll be told to call a ramp frequency, which covers the parking areas, and then hand it over to ground for the taxiways. Again, as soon as you talk to ground, you're likely to get complex instructions involving several taxiways, intersections, and holding points. Be ready to write it down. Then, if you have an app which allows you to draw on it, draw the route on the taxi chart before you set off. As you approach the runway holding point, again, there may be different instructions on when to talk to tower. It can be to call sign only, which is self-explanatory. It may be to call when ready for departure, in other words, when your checks are complete, or it may just be to call. Unless you've been told call sign only, call for departure as soon as you're ready. I've seen pilots sitting at the hold looking to see when there's a gap in arrivals before calling ready. You shouldn't do that. Just call when you're ready and let the controller do their job of deciding when traffic permits you to take off. You may sometimes be asked if you're ready immediate, and if you're not comfortable with this requirement, say negative, but be aware that that might result in a long delay. If you are given immediate takeoff, you must immediately taxi forward to line up and continue into the takeoff without stopping. If you're given a conditional clearance to line up behind a landing or taking off aircraft, they will use the word behind at the beginning and end of their instruction, such as November 21 Kilo, behind the landing citation, via Alpha 1, line up runway 24, behind. You must reply in the same format, including both behinds, and making the second behind the last word you use. Very often, particularly in Germany, you're expected to speak to the departure frequency either immediately after takeoff or at a certain altitude. This is marked on the SID plate, but it's not always very obvious. Very often, the tower will remind you, either explicitly or with a hint like saying, cleared for takeoff, have a nice flight, or even cleared for takeoff, tschüss. But even if they don't, it's your responsibility to read the plate and make the change. It's very unusual not to be given an altitude as part of your clearance, but if you haven't, you must follow the profile on the plate. If you're unable, because of the performance of your aircraft, to meet the profile, you should tell delivery as you pick up the clearance. If you don't know your profile angle, there's a chart in Jeppesen to calculate it. Alternatively, the rule of thumb to get the required rate of climb is to multiply the ground speed by the required percentage gradient. So, for example, if in your climb you need a 5% gradient and are flying at 90 knots ground speed, you need 450 feet per minute. For an 8% gradient at 100 knots, it's 800 feet per minute. If you're flying a twin, you need to determine whether the required profile can be achieved on one engine. Usually not, so you have to have a plan B ready. However, as I say, it's much more likely that you'll be given your altitude as part of your clearance, and once that happens, you only need to ensure that you meet the minimum altitude and the profile angle on the SID, unless you suffer a radio failure. In terms of lateral navigation, the same is true. You only follow the lines on the chart if you haven't been given a shortcut or vectors, but it's more common to fly the whole SID laterally than it is vertically. The most common instruction is to fly directly to the endpoint on the SID, as that is the point at which you're handed over to the airways controller, so no extra coordination is required. If you are given vectors, and this is a point for all IFR flying, not just SIDs, you must differentiate between track, heading, direct to, and own navigation to. It's becoming relatively less common to be given headings and more common to be given tracks. I suppose that's because these days, most IFR aircraft have a track pointer on their PFD, but of course many small GA aircraft don't, and they're best to use the track made good or TRK readout on their GNSS navigator. Sometimes one is left in some doubt as to which is required. For example, fly runway heading, which shouldn't be used but still sometimes is. Does that mean continue on the heading required to remain aligned with the runway centerline, or does it mean fly the runway QDM as a heading regardless of wind? I've heard very experienced training captains argue for each, but I teach that it means to remain on the extended centerline. The difference between direct to or own navigation to is that with direct to, you're expected to fly an exact straight line as if it were a part of a published procedure. Whereas own navigation implies that if you wish to make small deviations for weather or even sightseeing, you can. Remember in this context that you might be the only aircraft at your level for hundreds of miles around, and the controller has no need to tie you down precisely. But if you're being flown through departure and arrival routes, then he needs to know that you're following the cleared track precisely. Okay, so those are some pointers on departing where there's a connection between the airport and the airways system. Let's now talk about differences from the pattern I've described when you're departing from an airfield but it's not connected. Everywhere is different, but I think it's best to consider three main scenarios. Those which have IFR procedures and therefore have a communications channel with nearby controlled airspace. Those which are VFR with an informational radio service, which can get clearances on your behalf, but little more, and places where there's no provision, such as a private strip, or there's a radio operator, but without any idea about IFR. My advice is always to check before departure what the local practice or procedure is. If there's an information service or a radio operator, then either ask at the reception desk or in the tower or phone them. If no one can help, try asking local instructors or IFR pilots what they do. Usually, you'll find someone who will tell you which way to fly and what frequencies to talk to. Some places, Animas sticks in my mind, have some very precise VFR tracks to follow and altitudes at which you make the first call. But at most places, it's just a question of aiming for a particular airways waypoint and remaining below controlled airspace until cleared in. In other places, for example in France, you may well be in VFR in Class E airspace, so the conversion to IFR is seamless when you speak to the controller. Things are a little more difficult when there's no one to ask. Under those circumstances, I would still try to make a phone call, maybe to a nearby air traffic unit in the direction you're going to fly. In Switzerland, there are published numbers for Geneva and Zurich, depending where you're starting. In France, I would just call the ATC number for the nearest big airport, such as Lyon, Marseille, or whatever. In Germany, you could either do the same thing or call Langen, Bremen, or wherever you are. In the UK, there are numbers published for London and Scottish, or you could call Farnborough, Cardiff, Newcastle, Glasgow, or whoever is close and on your route. Sometimes the response will be to give you a squawk, a joining point, a frequency, and an instruction to remain outside controlled airspace. Sometimes you'll just be told to call airborne. If you can't find a phone number, or you can't get a sensible reply, you just need to get airborne, taking into account any slot restriction, and call. Then again, you have the choice of calling the local information frequency, such as Paris, London, or Langen information, or if you need to get into airspace near an airport, call the zone frequency for that airport, but still always remaining outside controlled airspace until cleared. You may be asked for your takeoff time, so have that to hand. The question of whether to enter clouds before getting your IFR clearance is not an obvious one. There are 3 risks of doing so. A regulatory risk. In Germany and Switzerland, and possibly elsewhere, it's simply illegal to fly in IMC below minimum IFR levels, which are generally in controlled airspace. Whether you'd ever be reported or prosecuted, I think is doubtful, but there must be a risk. Controlled flight into terrain, or CFIT. You're clearly not protected from terrain by IFR procedures, so if you're below the MSA, there's a risk from terrain and obstacles. Moving maps do a lot to mitigate this risk. Mid-air collision. This is a very low risk indeed, as the likelihood of you hitting another aircraft in cloud outside controlled airspace is much lower than in VMC. So, get airborne, get out of the immediate neighborhood of your departure field, and call whatever frequency you have planned and ask them to open your flight plan, unless your departure airfield has agreed to do so. They may identify you on radar, or they may just hand you over to the airways frequency. Sometimes they'll issue the clearance to enter controlled airspace, or they may leave that to the frequency they hand you over to. There are just so many variations, but your job is just to listen to the instructions and follow them. If you're departing from a strip, or from an airfield where the radio operator offers no service, you do much the same, but you know that you're appearing from nowhere, and you may need to say a little more about your intentions and wishes. You'll definitely need them to open your flight plan, and it sometimes takes them a moment to find it and to coordinate. So make sure that you remain outside controlled airspace for some time. If that is geographically impossible, you may have to hold or orbit. Decide in advance where you're going to do that. You may even program it into your navigator. You must always have a plan B as to what to do if you're not permitted to enter controlled airspace. This may be to fly the same route but below the base of controlled airspace, or if the airspace is Class E, it might be to fly at a VFR level. In extremis, if those are not options, you should have a planned route outside controlled airspace. In some countries, that route may be flown in IMC in Class G airspace, in others not. Your plan B may simply be land back at where you started, but you must have a plan. Just a word about Yankee and Zulu flight plans. In some countries, notably Germany, if you're departing from a VFR airfield, you cannot file an IFR plan. You must file a Zulu plan. If you have any difficulty remembering which is which, I use Viz, like the comic, to remember that if it's V, then I, it's Zulu, and Ivy, the stuff that grows on old houses, to remember if it's IFR first, then VFR, it's Yankee. If you're departing VFR, going IFR en route, then back VFR to land, it's still Zulu because it's VFR first. In other countries, such as the UK, you can file India from beginning to end, even if you're starting or ending VFR. So, I hope that I have successfully got you into the airways system, regardless of where you started. Now, let's talk about getting out again. Don't worry, it's not going to take as long because many of the principles are the same. Firstly, unless you're pressurized, you'll almost certainly need to prompt for descent. Pressurized aircraft go down at 2,000 feet a minute or more. We go down at 500. A jet flying at 220 knots needs to leave level 100 18 miles before touchdown. That's what the controller is used to. If we're flying at 140 knots at level 100, we need to start descent at about 50 nautical miles. Also, the airspace is often not really designed for such an early descent, so the controller may have to coordinate with the airspace below you, and that takes time, so you should start asking at maybe 60 miles. Furthermore, you may need to keep managing the descent and reminding the controller at each intermediate level that you need further descent. It can, and often does quite often happen, that the controller cannot descend you early, either because of airspace or traffic beneath you, and you're getting too high too close. Before the descent starts, or once it's started, you can ask for an increase in track miles. Be ready to quantify how many track miles you need, remembering you go down at approximately 300 feet per mile, even to the extent of going down in the hold. And/or you can increase your rate of descent depending on the resilience of your passengers' ears. Stars are similar to SIDS in that you should look at the various procedures long before you get there so you know what to expect. Follow ATC level and altitude clearances. Do not descend just because it instructs you on the plate. If there are altitude restrictions coming up, you can ask for confirmation from ATC whether you need to meet them. If you're going to an airfield outside controlled airspace, you might be given a star to a nearby airport without being told which airport it's attached to. This can be confusing, so make sure that you've looked at the various stars that you might be offered. Again, you can always ask. More and more airports are getting transitions, and the transition isn't necessarily obvious from the clearance, so have a look at the transitions as well as at the stars. For example, I was recently caught out going to Bremen. I was cleared direct to a waypoint which didn't appear on either the star nor any of the instrument procedures. I eventually found it embedded in a transition. On the navigator, the star is loaded as an arrival, but the transition is part of the approach. When you're cleared to a waypoint on a procedure, you're not usually told which procedure it's on. You need to look through whichever you find easier, the plates or the navigator, to find the procedure which contains that waypoint. Load that procedure and then do a direct to the waypoint. You'll then be cleared for the approach when you first talk to approach or director. There's another potential gotcha, which is particularly true of entering UK airspace from a French low-level IFR environment, anywhere on the North French coast, whereby you can be IFR at, say, flight level 70, expecting the world of IFR to continue uninterrupted, when Lille, Paris, Brest, or Deauville will simply tell you to contact London Information because you are temporarily below controlled airspace. Having left airspace, you must remain outside it unless or until you're cleared back in. So you have the choice of trying to get a clearance from London FIS. You may not have very long before you have to descend below 5,500 feet, or to give up and complete your journey outside controlled airspace. This is an annoying situation to face, and I'd recommend not getting below 80 in northern France if you're heading for the UK. If you're going to an IFR airfield outside controlled airspace, you'll probably be given a clearance to an initial approach fix for the instrument procedure in use, or sometimes just towards the airfield, before being transferred to the approach or information frequency for that airfield. Generally, you're safe to just follow that clearance, but there are some places, Shoreham in the UK comes to mind, where it's quite possible to follow the clearance and re-penetrate controlled airspace, which would be an infringement. So be careful once you're released to follow your progress on a VFR moving map. If you're going to a VFR airfield, you're likely to be taken to a waypoint relatively close to your destination, and then you'll leave controlled airspace and be expected to join the airfield visually. In most of Europe, it's your responsibility to cancel IFR, and until you do, you must be treated as IFR, including keeping you at a level or altitude above the MSA and the MEA. This can cause a dilemma if you're not technically VMC, but can see the ground and know from the METAR that the airfield is in good VMC. Technically, in Germany and Switzerland, you should divert to an airfield with an instrument approach. In other countries, you can use the bit of the instrument flight rules which say, except for the purpose of landing, but I'll leave you to take that decision. I mustn't advise you. There is a situation when you can be directed out of controlled airspace a long way from destination. This can creep up on you if you didn't notice that you're leaving controlled airspace until it's too late, at which point ATC may simply say squawk 7000, or conspicuity in the UK, and contact your en route frequency. So, two bits of advice. Firstly, keep your eye on the airspace you're in, and if you're cleared to leave controlled airspace too early, tell the controller that you wish to remain inside controlled airspace until you're closer. That sometimes works. And secondly, have your VFR moving map to hand and be ready to navigate to a destination without penetrating any controlled airspace, danger or restricted airspace, glider sites, NOTAMs, or any of the other stuff that's why we go IFR. Finally, closing your flight plan. This is a topic that no one really seems to know the answer to, so it's best to err on the side of caution. Whatever else you do, I recommend putting an arrival message on the app used to file the plan, such as ForeFlight or Autorouter. I can't speak for ForeFlight, but on Autorouter, this is easily achieved on Telegram. Just type arrival and a 4-number arrival time. Secondly, if there's an ATC or information service at your destination, they should close it without being asked. But in some countries, they need to be asked or even won't do it, telling you that you need to phone AIS yourself. This is true in small Swiss airfields and in many French airfields, especially if the tower is unmanned or only has a radio operator. Thirdly, you can usually ask flight information to close your plan once you become VFR. Some will, others will say that you can only do it after landing. There may be a pattern to all this across Europe, but if there is, in all my 52 years of flying throughout the continent, I've never spotted what the pattern is. I've raised many ifs, buts, and maybes in this video, so I end the way I started. If in doubt, ask. Happy flying, and see you in the next video.